January 17th, 1942. Philippine Sea. 0447 hours. The sky is still black. No moon, the kind of darkness that swallows ships whole, where the line between ocean and heaven dissolves into a single void. Lieutenant Commander Tameichi Hara stands on the bridge of the destroyer Amatsukaze, his hands gripping cold steel, eyes straining into nothingness. Around him, the crew moves in practiced silence, their breath visible in the pre-dawn chill. They are hunting. Somewhere in that darkness, American ships are running, and the Imperial Japanese Navy, fresh from their triumph at Pearl Harbor just weeks before, is closing in for the kill. Hara's training taught him to trust his eyes, his instincts, the ancient art of night fighting that Japanese naval doctrine had perfected through decades of rigorous preparation. His men can spot a ship's silhouette at distances that would astound Western navies. They have trained in darkness until their eyes became instruments of war, until they could read the shape of a destroyer against starlight, distinguish friend from enemy by the angle of a smokestack. Tonight, as on every night, vision is everything. Vision is survival. Vision is victory. He does not know that vision has already become obsolete. 300 nautical miles to the southeast, aboard the heavy cruiser USS Northampton, a different kind of watch is being kept. In a cramped compartment below deck, lit by the green glow of cathode ray tubes, radar man second class Robert Mitchell sits before a screen that looks like something from a fever dream. Sweeping lines of phosphorescent light rotate across a circular display, and on that screen, glowing like ghosts, are the Japanese ships. Mitchell can see them. All of them. Their exact position, their course, their speed. He can see them from over 20 miles away, through darkness that renders them completely invisible to human eyes. He keys his microphone and reports bearing and range to the bridge, his voice steady, professional, almost bored. Above him, officers plot firing solutions for guns that will send shells screaming into the night toward targets their gunners will never see. The Americans are not hunting. They are conducting an execution. This is not how naval warfare was supposed to work. For 3,000 years, from the triremes of Athens to the dreadnoughts of Jutland, naval combat had obeyed certain immutable laws. Ships fought by day when they could see, or at night at point-blank range where searchlights could illuminate targets and turn darkness into temporary, violent noon. Commanders positioned their vessels according to weather, sun angle, visibility. The side that spotted the enemy first usually won. Battle was a contest of human senses sharpened by training, aided by optics, but ultimately bound by the limitations of the human eye. Nelson at Trafalgar, Togo at Tsushima, Jellicoe at Jutland, all had commanded by what they could see, or by what their lookouts reported seeing. Naval warfare was fundamentally about vision, about controlling the visible space of battle. And then came radar. The British called it RDF, radio direction finding, a deliberately bland name designed to conceal its revolutionary nature. The Americans called it radar, from radio detection and ranging, a more honest descriptor of its almost supernatural capability. The principle was simple enough. Transmit radio waves, wait for them to bounce off distant objects, measure the time delay of the return signal. The execution was monstrously complex, requiring advances in electronics, pulse transmission, antenna design, and display technology that pushed 1940s engineering to its absolute limits. The British had been first, developing Chain Home, the network of radar stations that gave them precious minutes of warning during the Battle of Britain, turning the skies over England from an ambush zone into a surveilled battlespace where every German bomber was detected, tracked, and met by fighters that seemed to appear from nowhere. But naval radar was different. Ships moved. Ships rolled and pitched in seas that could swing an antenna through wild arcs. Ships had to detect other ships against the cluttered return signal of ocean waves, had to distinguish steel hulls from rain squalls and sea spray. The sets had to be compact enough to fit on vessels already crammed with weapons, armor, machinery, and men. They had to work when soaked with salt spray, when subjected to the concussive blast of main battery guns, when electrical systems groaned under combat loads. Making radar work on land was an achievement. Making it work at sea was a miracle of engineering that would reshape warfare forever. By late 1941, American ships were being fitted with increasingly sophisticated radar sets. The SC series provided air search capability, scanning the skies for enemy aircraft. The SG surface search radar could detect ships beyond visual range, even in total darkness, even in fog, even in the smoke and chaos of battle. Fire control radars allowed guns to track targets with precision that made human optical range-finding seem like guesswork. These were not perfect systems. Early sets were temperamental, prone to failure, limited in range. Operators were still learning what they were seeing, still developing the skills to interpret the green glow of the scope. But even in their primitive form, these devices represented a fundamental shift in the nature of naval combat. For the first time in history, human vision was no longer the primary sensor of naval warfare. The Japanese knew radar existed. Their own engineers had developed sets, had understood the principle. But Japanese naval doctrine, shaped by decades of success and validated by the stunning victories of December 1941, did not prioritize electronics. The Imperial Navy invested instead in optics, in training, in the superior night fighting capability that had become their signature advantage. Lookouts were legendary. Japanese binoculars were the finest in the world. Japanese night tactics had been refined through countless exercises until they approached perfection. Why invest scarce resources in unproven technology when traditional methods worked so superbly? Why trust a glowing screen when you had men who could see in the dark? It was a reasonable question. It would be answered in blood. The first true demonstration came not in a single cataclysmic battle, but in a series of engagements throughout 1942 and 1943, where American ships began to fight differently, to move with an eerie confidence through conditions that should have rendered them blind. In the Solomon Islands campaign, in the grinding attrition of the South Pacific, a pattern emerged. American ships would maneuver at night with lights off, radio silence maintained, yet somehow they always seemed to know where the Japanese were. American guns would open fire at ranges where targets were invisible, and those first salvos would land with uncanny accuracy, as if the Americans were cheating, as if they possessed some dark magic that let them see through darkness itself. They were cheating. They were using radar. Commander Hara would later write in his memoirs about the creeping realization that something had changed, that the Americans had some advantage his intelligence officers could not explain. He described night engagements where American ships would turn toward his formation before his lookouts had spotted anything, where American guns would fire before his own vessels had been detected. He wrote of the frustration, the sense that the rules of naval warfare had been rewritten without anyone telling the Imperial Navy. Other Japanese officers reported similar experiences, the feeling of fighting an enemy who could see them but whom they could not see, the psychological pressure of knowing that darkness, once Japan's greatest tactical advantage, had become a liability. The Battle of Cape St. George on November 25, 1943, exemplified the new reality with brutal clarity. 5 American destroyers under Captain Arleigh Burke intercepted 5 Japanese destroyers attempting a supply run to Buka. The engagement occurred in total darkness, the kind of moonless night where Japanese night fighting doctrine should have given them every advantage. Instead, Burke's destroyers, guided by radar, executed a textbook interception. They detected the Japanese formation at over 20,000 yards, maneuvered into perfect firing position, and launched torpedoes before the Japanese even knew American ships were present. 3 Japanese destroyers were sunk. Not one American ship was hit. The Americans had achieved what naval tacticians would have considered impossible just 2 years earlier: a perfect nocturnal ambush against an enemy specifically trained for night combat. But the true revolution of radar extended beyond simple detection. It transformed naval gunnery from an art into a science. Before radar, hitting a target at sea required optical rangefinders, mechanical computers, and a great deal of luck. Shells traveled through 3-dimensional space while both firing ship and target ship moved in 6 degrees of freedom: pitch, roll, yaw, and motion along 3 axes. Gunners had to calculate range, bearing, target course, and speed, then factor in wind, air temperature, the rotation of the Earth itself. They had to predict where the target would be when the shells arrived, accounting for flight time that could exceed 30 seconds for long-range shots. All of this calculation depended on accurate ranging, and optical rangefinders had severe limitations. Their effective range decreased with visibility. Smoke, mist, darkness, even heat haze could make accurate ranging impossible. Radar-directed fire control changed everything. The Mark 8 fire control radar could track a target continuously, feeding real-time range and bearing data directly into the ship's mechanical fire control computer. Gunners could engage targets they could not see, could maintain accurate fire through smoke and darkness, could hit ships at ranges where optical systems were useless. The difference in effectiveness was staggering. Studies conducted after the war showed that radar-directed gunfire was accurate at nearly twice the range of optically directed fire and achieved hit rates 3 to 4 times higher. Ships that would have been safe at 15,000 yards suddenly found themselves under accurate fire from beyond the horizon. Japanese naval aviators, perhaps more than surface sailors, felt the impact of American radar with a particular horror. They had trained for years to be the finest carrier pilots in the world, and in the war's early months, they proved it. Japanese naval aviators sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse, struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision, ranged across the Pacific like eagles. Their skills were honed by brutal training that killed many before they ever saw combat. Those who survived were superlative pilots, comfortable with night operations, skilled at low-level attacks, trained in tactics that required split-second timing and absolute precision. Then they began encountering American combat air patrols that seemed to be waiting for them. Fighter directors aboard American ships, watching radar screens, could see Japanese strike packages forming up 50 miles away, could vector defending fighters to intercept attackers before they reached their targets. Japanese pilots who had expected to achieve surprise instead found themselves ambushed, bounced by Wildcats and Hellcats that came diving out of clouds with perfect positioning. The psychological impact was devastating. There is a particular terror in believing yourself the hunter only to discover you are the prey, in realizing that your careful approach, your skillful formation keeping, your months of training, all of it was irrelevant because the enemy saw you from the moment you took off. Radar allowed something that had never existed before in naval aviation: comprehensive surveillance of the battlespace. Fighter direction officers could maintain a complete picture of all aircraft within 100 miles. They knew where every friendly fighter was, where every enemy bomber was, could coordinate intercepts with an efficiency that made old-fashioned combat air patrols look like chaos. American carriers began recovering aircraft at night, guiding them home by radar when they would otherwise have been lost. They could launch strikes in weather that would have grounded Japanese aircraft, could navigate through overcast that rendered visual navigation impossible. Radar gave the Americans operational flexibility that compounded their numerical and industrial advantages turning American carriers into all-weather platforms that could fight around the clock. The Japanese response to radar was handicapped by multiple factors. Their electronics industry lacked the manufacturing precision needed to produce the high-frequency components radar required in quantity. Vacuum tubes that American factories turned out by the millions were precious commodities in Japan. Copper, needed for waveguides and antenna elements, was scarce. Even when Japanese engineers developed functional radar sets, there were never enough to equip more than a fraction of the fleet. And perhaps more critically, Japanese naval doctrine was institutionally resistant to radar. Officers trained to trust their eyes, their instincts, their visual skills did not easily adapt to trusting a green screen operated by technicians. There was a cultural dimension to this resistance, a sense that radar was a mechanical crutch, that true warriors fought with eyes and skill, not with electronics. This attitude was catastrophic. By 1944, the gap between American and Japanese naval capabilities had become a chasm, and radar was a primary cause. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Marianas Turkey Shoot, radar allowed American fighters to intercept and destroy Japanese strike packages with methodical efficiency. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft that attacked the American fleet on June 19, 1944, 243 were shot down. American losses totaled 29 aircraft. It was not a battle, it was an extermination enabled by radar direction that gave American fighters every advantage. Japanese pilots, many of them poorly trained replacements for the veterans lost at Midway and in the Solomons, flew into a defensive system they could not comprehend, let alone defeat. But radar's impact extended beyond combat effectiveness. It changed the daily rhythm of naval operations. American ships could maintain formation at night without lights, could steam through fog banks without fear of collision, could navigate coastal waters in conditions that would have been suicidal without electronic assistance. Fleet maneuvers became possible in weather that would have scattered formations in earlier eras. Supply operations could continue through tropical squalls. The operational tempo of the American fleet increased because radar reduced the limitations imposed by darkness and weather. Ships that would have had to heave to and wait for dawn could now continue operations, pressing forward with a relentlessness that exhausted the Japanese. There is an object that appears repeatedly in the accounts of American radar operators, mentioned in memoirs and oral histories with a frequency that gives it symbolic weight: the coffee cup. In the radar rooms of American ships, where men sat before glowing screens in darkened compartments, coffee was constant. Hot, strong, bitter coffee in ceramic mugs that left rings on technical manuals and logbooks. The coffee represented something fundamental about American naval warfare in the radar age: endurance, vigilance maintained not through warrior spirit or martial discipline, but through caffeine, technology, and systematic organization. The radar operator with his coffee was the new face of naval combat, a technician more than a warrior, monitoring screens in climate-controlled compartments far from the spray and violence of the deck. This image would have been incomprehensible to officers of earlier generations, to men who had stood on open bridges in all weather, who had commanded by voice and gesture, who had navigated by stars and currents. Naval warfare was becoming abstract, mediated by electronics, fought by men who saw battle as glowing blips on oscilloscopes. There was something being lost: the direct, physical experience of combat, the visceral reality of seeing your enemy. But there was also something being gained: precision, efficiency, the ability to fight in conditions that would have been impossible for Nelson's fleet or Togo's battleships. The Japanese never closed the radar gap. Even as their situation became desperate, even as defeat followed defeat, they could not match American electronic capabilities. Japanese radar sets remained inferior in range, reliability, and availability. Japanese operators never achieved the skill levels of their American counterparts. Japanese doctrine never fully integrated radar into tactics and strategy. This was not due to any lack of courage or intelligence. Japanese engineers understood the principles. Japanese scientists were capable. But Japan's industrial base could not support the mass production of high-precision electronics while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, tanks, and ammunition. Choices had to be made, and radar consistently received lower priority than weapon systems. It seemed more important to build another cruiser than to equip existing ships with better radar. This was a miscalculation of historic proportions. The cruiser built without adequate radar was a blind giant, powerful but vulnerable. The carrier without radar could not defend itself from air attack or find enemy ships to strike. The destroyer without radar could not fight effectively at night. One by one, Japanese ships went to the bottom, destroyed by enemies they never saw, killed by shells and torpedoes launched from beyond visual range. Their crews died with the same courage their ancestors had shown for centuries, but courage could not defeat radio waves. By 1945, the disparity was absolute. American ships operated with multiple radar sets providing overlapping coverage of air and surface threats. Integrated combat information centers synthesized data from multiple sensors, presenting commanders with a unified picture of the battlespace. American fighters were directed to intercepts with such precision that Japanese pilots reported feeling like they were being tracked by an invisible intelligence. American submarines, equipped with radar, could detect Japanese ships at night and surface to attack with virtual impunity. The seas around Japan became a killing ground where Japanese vessels ventured out, knowing they would likely be detected, tracked, and destroyed by enemies who saw them long before they could see their foes. There is a poetic irony in how the tool that doomed the Japanese Navy was based on the same electromagnetic principles that powered their own radios. Radio had been seen as a communication technology, a way to send messages across distance. Radar revealed that electromagnetic radiation could be used to sense the physical world, to transform invisible radio waves into vision that penetrated darkness, fog, and distance. It was a cognitive leap, a recognition that information could be gathered from the environment itself by actively probing it with energy and analyzing the reflections. This leap was made simultaneously by multiple nations, but it was the Americans and British who industrialized it, who turned a laboratory curiosity into a mass-produced weapon system that reshaped warfare. The radar revolution represented something larger than a mere technological advantage. It symbolized a fundamental philosophical difference in how America approached war, where the Japanese emphasized warrior spirit, training, and human capability. The Americans emphasized industrial production, technological innovation, and systems integration. Where Japan sought to win through superior fighting spirit and skill, America sought to win through superior information and material abundance. The radar operator with his coffee cup, sitting before his screen in climate-controlled comfort, represented an American way of war that was less glorious, less romantic, but ultimately more effective than centuries of martial tradition. This is not to diminish Japanese courage or skill. Japanese sailors and aviators fought with extraordinary bravery, often in hopeless situations, always against increasing odds. But they were fighting a 20th century war with 19th century tools, relying on human senses that evolution had optimized for terrestrial predators, not for detecting steel ships at ranges of 20 miles. The Americans had transcended human sensory limitations, had created electronic eyes that saw farther and more clearly than any biological organ could achieve. It was an unfair fight in the most fundamental sense. One side could see, the other could not. After the war, when American intelligence officers interrogated Japanese naval officers and reviewed captured documents, the Japanese obsession with American radar capabilities became clear. Report after report mentioned enemy detection apparatus, speculated on its capabilities, recommended countermeasures, but the recommendations were futile. The countermeasures proposed, increased radio discipline, evasive maneuvering, attacks timed to exploit radar's supposed limitations, were based on fundamental misunderstandings of what radar could and could not do. The Japanese never grasped how complete American radar coverage had become, never understood that American ships were not just detecting their presence, but tracking their every movement, not just finding them, but predicting their maneuvers and preparing ambushes with scientific precision. Commander Hara survived the war. In his memoirs, published decades later, he wrote with painful honesty about the futility of fighting an enemy who possessed technological supremacy. He described the helplessness of commanding a ship that was effectively blind while facing enemies who could see perfectly. He wrote of sending men into battles where they had no realistic chance of victory, not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they lacked the tools needed to fight effectively. His words carry the weight of a man who watched his service become obsolete, who saw the traditions and skills of the Imperial Navy rendered irrelevant by technology he could not counter. There is a broader lesson here about the nature of warfare and technological change. Military organizations are inherently conservative. They invest enormous resources in training personnel, developing doctrine, building weapon systems optimized for specific ways of fighting. When technology disrupts those investments, when new tools render old skills obsolete, the psychological and institutional resistance can be overwhelming. The Japanese Navy had spent decades perfecting night fighting techniques, had killed and injured men in training to achieve peak proficiency, had built their entire tactical doctrine around visual surveillance and human skill. Admitting that all of this was now obsolete, that electronic boxes tended by technicians could replace years of training and tradition, it was asking them to admit that their professional identity was obsolete. The Americans, perhaps because they came to naval power more recently, perhaps because their culture was more comfortable with technological change, made the transition more easily. American naval officers were often skeptical of radar initially, but they were willing to experiment, to let results speak for themselves. When radar proved effective, the American Navy integrated it rapidly, developed new tactics around it, trained operators in numbers that overwhelmed the Japanese capacity to respond. This organizational adaptability, more than any single technological advantage, may have been America's decisive edge. The symbolic coffee cup reappears here, representing not just endurance, but a certain democratic pragmatism. In the American Navy, the radar man, often a young enlisted sailor from some Kansas farm or Brooklyn neighborhood, held as much tactical importance as any officer on the bridge. The information he reported from his glowing screen shaped decisions at the highest levels. There was something fundamentally American about this, about the way technology could elevate an ordinary seaman into a key decision-maker, about the way competence with machines mattered more than aristocratic lineage or warrior tradition. The radar room was a meritocracy of the present where what you could do with the equipment in front of you mattered infinitely more than who your ancestors were. When the war ended, radar was ubiquitous on American ships. What had been exotic technology in 1941 was standard equipment by 1945. Post-war naval design made radar integration a primary consideration. The lessons were clear. No modern warship could fight effectively without comprehensive radar coverage. The navies of the world absorbed this lesson. Within a decade, every major navy had radar-equipped vessels. The technology spread, evolved, became more sophisticated. Today, radar is so fundamental to naval operations that its absence is unthinkable. Modern warships bristle with antenna arrays, emit and receive electromagnetic radiation across dozens of frequencies, paint their battlespace with radio waves as routinely as ancient sailors read the stars. But in 1942, in 1943, in 1944, radar was still magic to those who faced it without adequate counters. Japanese pilots, Japanese sailors, Japanese commanders fought against an enemy who seemed to possess supernatural awareness, who could see through clouds and darkness, who struck from beyond visual range with accuracy that should have been impossible. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy with such an advantage cannot be overstated. War is already terrifying, already chaotic. Add to that chaos the knowledge that your enemy can see you while you are blind, that your skills and training have been rendered obsolete by technology you cannot match, that every action you take is observed and countered by forces you cannot detect. It is a recipe for despair. That despair seeps through the later Japanese war documents, through the increasingly desperate tactical guidance, through the after-action reports that describe defeat after defeat, always with the notation that American detection capabilities exceeded expectations. There is tragedy in those documents, the tragedy of competent professionals realizing their competence no longer matters, that they are fighting with obsolete tools against an enemy who has moved beyond the warfare they understand. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated the complete triumph of radar-enabled warfare. American ships tracked Japanese formations across hundreds of miles, coordinated complex fleet movements in darkness and poor visibility, directed aircraft to targets beyond visual range, and executed gunnery with such precision that Japanese ships were destroyed by enemies they often never saw. The Japanese fought with desperate courage, but courage was insufficient. They were fighting 20th century battles with 19th century capabilities, and the result was inevitable. In the end, radar did not win the Pacific War by itself. American victory rested on industrial capacity, code breaking, submarine warfare, strategic decisions, and the accumulated effect of 1,000 factors. But radar was the force multiplier that made everything else more effective. It allowed American carriers to operate safely, knowing they would receive warning of air attacks. It allowed American cruisers and destroyers to fight at night with confidence. It made American submarines more deadly hunters. It gave American forces operational freedom to act in weather and darkness that grounded Japanese operations. And it represented something fundamental about the American approach to war, the conviction that technology, properly applied, could overcome traditional military virtues. This was not a new American instinct. It stretched back to the Civil War, to the Union's industrial mobilization, to the mass production of rifles and artillery that overwhelmed Confederate valor. But radar perfected the approach, turned it into a comprehensive system where information dominance created tactical superiority that no amount of courage could overcome. The green glow of the radar screen, watched by a sailor with a coffee cup, became the face of modern naval warfare. Not glorious, not romantic, but brutally effective. The anonymous technician monitoring returns, the officer plotting intercepts on a chart, the integration of sensor data and weapon systems. This was war as industrial process, war as system, war where victory went not to the bravest but to the best informed. The Japanese admirals who had studied Mahan and Clausewitz, who had absorbed centuries of naval tradition, found themselves commanding forces that belonged to an earlier age. Their ships were steel, their weapons modern, but their methods of gathering information, of understanding the battle space, remained rooted in the age of sail. The Americans had leaped forward, had created new ways of seeing and knowing that rendered traditional methods obsolete. This is the eternal tragedy of warfare, that the skills learned through suffering and sacrifice can become worthless overnight when technology shifts the foundations of combat. The Japanese night fighting expertise, purchased through years of brutal training and countless exercises, became a liability the moment American ships could see through darkness. All that effort, all that sacrifice, rendered meaningless by electronic boxes tended by operators who had trained for months, not years. Looking back from our present age, when radar is omnipresent, when we are surveilled by satellites and drones and sensors beyond counting, when privacy itself is becoming obsolete, the radar revolution of World War II seems almost quaint. But in its moment, it was earth-shaking. It represented humanity's first step toward comprehensive electromagnetic awareness of the battlefield, toward the sensor-saturated warfare that defines modern combat. The lesson extends beyond military history. It speaks to how quickly technological change can overturn established hierarchies, how tools can reshape society in ways their inventors never imagined. Radar began as a defensive system to provide warning of bomber attacks. It ended as an offensive weapon that revolutionized naval warfare. The scientists who developed it were solving an immediate tactical problem. They unleashed a transformation that reshaped how nations fight at sea. And in that transformation, in that green glow of the cathode ray tube, in the coffee-sustained vigilance of the radar operator, we can see a truth about modern warfare, about American warfare specifically. That victory comes not from warrior spirit, but from information superiority, not from individual heroism, but from system integration, not from accepting the limitations of human senses, but from transcending them with technology. It is a less poetic truth than older conceptions of warfare, but it is the truth that radar wrote across the Pacific in the wreckage of ships and aircraft, in battles fought by enemies who could not see each other, in the triumph of electromagnetic sight over biological vision. The destroyer steams through darkness, its radar spinning, painting the world in radio waves, seeing what cannot be seen. Somewhere beyond the horizon, enemies maneuver, unaware they have already been found, that shells are being loaded and guns trained on coordinates they cannot imagine. This is the new warfare. This is radar's gift and curse. The ability to see without being seen, to know without being known, to strike from beyond vision itself. It changed everything. And those who could not adapt, who fought with eyes alone, discovered that darkness had become their enemy, that invisibility was no longer protection, that the seas had become transparent to those who knew how to look. They never saw it coming. That was the point.